general, it's very important to check everything that you believe.
Some of the newer practitioners,
so much misinformation out there.
It's healthy to question your ideologies.
Take people's unverified personal gnosis.
All these different bad habits like
reasonings with ourselves and going over rationality.
Thinking everyone's against you, thinking everyone else is wrong.
Escapism.
Attacking others because they don't agree with you.
Where they don't want to deal with like any negativity or any criticism.
The right hand and the left hand path.
And it feels like a personal attack against you.
Any sort of darkness or badness in their life.
Where the dichotomy begins.
It's important to open yourself.
Is it really valuable or meaningful?
My name is AIDEN.
GEORGINA.
CHANDLER.
Welcome to Occultism, the side of Saul.
We're going to be talking about something that plagues many occultists in our community. That would be imposter syndrome. But imposter syndrome is effectively this idea that what you're practicing, what you're doing is not actually valid. What you're doing is not even with reliable results, it's not real practice, basically. And I think this is something that affects many people, regardless of skill level. It affects people no matter how long they've been practicing.
When we were looking into imposter syndrome to kind of begin this episode, we did a little bit of research on the psychology, and we realized that there's this graph that comes up a lot when you look up what imposter syndrome is, and it includes what's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. So essentially this thing is a map that some psychologists came up with in the 90s where they figured out the way that you gain and the trajectory the average person has when they gain knowledge in a new area. So it begins with knowing nothing, where you think you know nothing, and you climb up what they call Mount Stupid. I know it's a little crude, but that's actually what the graphs say. And you're at this point where you have so much confidence and you think you know everything, but you actually don't know very much. You've just read a few books and you're like, oh, I know this occultism thing. I know everything that it is. And then you realize that you don't know as much as you think you know. And you crash and you fall super, super far to what they call the valley of despair. And through time, after realizing that, you progressively realize, since you thought you knew everything, you realize you know nothing. After this point, you slowly learn things and your confidence grows as your experience grows. And progressively you reach a state where you feel stable, but imposter syndrome occurs after you have that crash. I think probably everyone who's an occultist has felt imposter syndrome. For me, I've felt both of these Dunning-Kruger and imposter syndrome things, and I think both are kind of an issue in our community. For me, imposter syndrome is something I feel pretty much constantly. As someone who does a podcast and runs an occult Instagram and does tarot readings and stuff, people do sometimes kind of treat me like I'm some sort of person who's knowledgeable or ask me questions. And I've even had the occasional DM of someone asking me to mentor them, and it just I'm oh my god, I'm so not the person you should be talking to about this. I feel even though I've been doing this for quite a bit of time and I read a lot or whatever, I constantly feel I don't know, and I don't know that much. I feel in the occult, or maybe this is just me, and this is a me experience and I'm projecting, there's this feeling that no matter how much you read, you'll always be a beginner, which in a way is kind of good and exciting and shows that there's always more to learn. But I think, the more you get into the community and the more experience you have and the more people consider you, a more advanced practitioner, for me, the more insecure I feel. Because I feel these people are going to, somehow, realize I'm, a fraud or something.
I've also had people ask me to mentor them, and I also agree that I feel I'm unworthy of that kind of thing and that I don't know enough. I often find myself between Mount Stupid, Vow of Despair, and Plateau of Sustainability. Those are the 3 points that I identify with the most. And I feel the Dunning-Kruger effect is a cycle I go through very frequently. I find myself thinking I know a lot when I get into something new, then realizing I don't know enough, even after trying to write essays on it. and then I eventually realize more, and then I just flatten out, and I am sustained. And I think the path to sustainability is, contrary to what you might expect, is worse than Valley of Despair for me, because it gives me this feeling that I'm not ready for something new, but I've already done so much that I don't know where to go next.
I have the same feeling that it's a recurring thing, right? I am not, admittedly, I'm not as learned as you two. I do think that a lot of my my experience comes from practice and not research, and that put me on a peak of Mount Stupid for a long time. And right now I'm kind of on my slope of enlightenment, trying to gain knowledge from a lot of sources at once. But that can be really overwhelming and just push you back into the valley of despair. If your slope feels too steep, you're not going to be able to climb it, right? So for me, as someone who has struggled with imposter syndrome from coming into being very confident about my workings or my beliefs or my crafts, because I am someone who thinks and philosophizes on their own and has found a lot of overlaps in other people's philosophies that align with my own thoughts. It's kind of a confirmation, but at the same time it kind of sets me back a little, because it's like when you come into your own and you feel like you start having these ideas, you're like, oh, I'm like, I know what I'm doing now. I know what I am, what I'm about. But then you come across what I think is probably the biggest instiller of imposter syndrome is community. And that's probably a little controversial to say. However, let me explain. When you are on your own, say a solitary practitioner, a purely solitary practitioner that does not talk in communities, does not talk in forums, does not try to expand their mindset through other people's minds, but only through their own pathway and research, you are cutting yourself off to a lot of different ideas. But when you do introduce yourself into a community like that, you are putting at risk everything that you know and believe. I've also been approached for mentorship, and I can confidently say that I do not solidly know enough to mentor people, or at least be comfortable mentoring people. And for me, it's a huge compliment, but when someone asks you to mentor and you consider it for 1 or 2 minutes, and you think, oh well, what would I teach this person, and you come up empty-handed, it kind of shoots you down into your valley to despair even more, because it's this constant battle of do I know what I'm doing, and do I really have a foundation for what I'm doing? Because if it's not teachable, it doesn't feel like it's real sometimes. When things don't translate as teachable, they seem like they're false. And this will shove you further into an idea of imposter syndrome. No matter what proof you have or comfort you have, if someone asks a question and you can't answer it, you ultimately feel like you're faking something, or you're falsifying your identity, and you're trying to just have this what a lot of people would call smoke and mirrors around you, just to make yourself seem either wiser or more mystic or esoteric. And it's kind of humbling in a way, because I do feel like it's very easy to learn a lot of what you like and what you know, and when someone comes in with a big old fly swatter and is like, well, what about this, and you have no comment on it, if you have no knowledge of it, then it kind of puts you in your place, and it kind of shoves you off what would be a plateau of sustainability to you is a peak of Mount Stupid to someone else. And I do find it has this kind of cyclical nature of constantly learning, to where you'll feel like you have a good mastery, or you have a good foundation in something, right? And someone will just shove you off that cliff and be like, well, you don't really know X, Y, or Z, or bring up a topic that you're completely unaware of. And I feel like the communal aspects of occultism, whenever you get into a community, there always seems to be like a hierarchy of knowledge. And I know everyone tries to learn from each other, but there's always one or two people that feel like they're ultimately turned to, or feel like they're always right or have more experience, and they are the quote-unquote guru of their community.
Yeah, I really wanted to touch on your solitary and community aspect. So I was a solitary practitioner for a very long time. I had a few friends and a few people who sort of practiced, but not like, I wasn't like in a group. And so now that I'm older and able to go to these in-person events, I've been to a fair amount of rituals and events, but like if now that some of those people actually like know about my podcast to an extent, like if you see me at those events, like I'm almost silent. I'm so quiet. And then you hear me on this podcast and I'm so loud, and it's because I get like so like people will be talking about something and I'll know exactly what they're talking about. If anything, like it's something that I understand well, like especially when Kabbalah comes up. Like people will be talking about it and I'll be able to follow the conversation so seamlessly. Like it'll all make so much sense to me, but I'll just be so nervous to talk because I'm like, well, one, I'm younger than most people here because I am a pretty young person, and two, like I'm new and I'm like, I don't want to make a fool of myself in front of these people who've been practicing for longer and all know each other. And so I end up just being quiet at these events. Like, I think now that some of these people know about my podcast, they'd honestly be just very surprised by how I am on here and kind of with this confidence. Because I get so quiet because I think, like, I have this big fear of being judged, which that gets into a lot of deeper psychology. But I think, like, the thing that throws me personally in the mountain of despair is the thoughts of others, because I think we're all, as occultists, kind of scared of the possibility that we're all crazy or that we've wasted so much time in our lives on this stuff that may be nothing or may just be our own insanity, right? Like, I think this fear of either wasting time or being completely delusional is something that is an insecurity in a lot of practitioners. Like there's a reason why I know a lot of people, and I was not a very open occultist for a very long time, and now I'm very open about it. And I think just like the coming as a more vocal occultist, like I think there's a reason why so many people are so private about this. Because I think since occultism is so personal, like what I do in my personal practice, I don't really share, but like, this stuff is just deeply personal, I think, to everyone who practices it. And so this fear of kind of judgment and being seen as not good enough just kind of plagues people. And I think it ends with, like, this trap, this huge trap. Because you're not going to feel like an imposter syndrome if you're not an imposter to someone else. Like, the imposter syndrome implies a relationship with another person, right? Because if you're just in your own space, like maybe you'll think, yeah, I'm not that great of a magician or whatever, but you're not going to think, I'm a fraud. Unless you're just worrying about sanity. And so I think like the imposter syndrome gets so strong and the heat gets turned up to 10 the second you interact with someone in person because it's easier online. Still, there is communities online that have some intensity, but I think just this fear. And I mean, I think we can be self-aware enough, and this podcast is guilty of it on itself. As the occult community, especially the online one, there is a lot of judgment going on. Elitism is a whole can of worms that I don't really want to get into. But I think, like, this fear of judgment, because it's so personal, is why this stuff gets so big for some people.
I understand why a lot of people would privatize their practice and become completely solitary, because I don't think it's a very deep psychological thing to say. I think that most humans fear judgment. I think most people would be open about saying they do not like being judged, or they do not want to be judged or put in a negative light. Even if it's to a complete stranger, it would confuse you, because if you know what you're doing, or if you have basis or knowledge on what you're doing, you should have confidence in it. But that kind of confidence can be shaken with exterior knowledge and with outside sources coming in and trying to develop a conversation, but it doesn't feel like a conversation's being developed. It feels like an attack against yourself. The idea of being crazy as a magician is something that extremely resonates with me. My practice is something that a lot of people would paint as a medical condition, much like the two top fears that I hear a lot of magicians having are people talking about their magical experiences and then going on to say, I fear that if I talked about this too much, people would either say I have the mental illness of schizophrenia, or I have psychosis. And that is something that I feel like a lot of people do fear, and I feel like that's a valid fear to have. I feel like it's valid to constantly try to keep yourself tied down to the real world whenever you are practicing occultism. And when I say the real world, I mean our shared accepted reality. So the idea that, like, you know, everything we do in occultism kind of does have a theological or a theurgical perspective to it, and occultism comes out of wanting to know the secret truth, right? That's what occultism means, or is like hidden truth. It's one of these things where we try to approach this statement that there is a truth to be discovered in many different ways, in many different forms, and we all have our different takes on it, but the majority to us as occultists will generally say, like, you're either crazy, a devil worshipper, a snake oiler, or a con artist. And it's one of these things where it's like, oh, are you a cult leader? Are you a con artist? Or, like, a lot of people say that psychics and tarot readers just abuse people that are in emotional states for money. And I disagree with that wholeheartedly. I think that it's something that if you believe in it, you are paying for divination, and if it's something you don't believe in, you're paying for entertainment. That's my view on it. But I know a lot of people do have this fear of sharing their experiences and then being painted as something negative. And I feel like that does feed into the imposter mindset a lot. Like, because I even ask myself all the time, I'm like, am I slipping into madness? And if my day-to-day life isn't affected, and if I'm going into specific mindsets in specific places and doing specific rituals in order to access something specific, and it happens during that time, but no other times, I feel better about my own sanity. But a lot of people want to share their experiences with others, and they will be written off as crazy, for lack of a better word. And I feel like that is something that definitely perpetuates this idea that you're an imposter, or you're a person that stayed inside way too long, or you're you're just outright like a lunatic. But I don't think there's damage in keeping your mind about you, your wits about you, and giving a little leeway or humor to those thoughts, because once you do that and you subject yourself to them and the answer is no, then it kind of gets you out of your valley of despair and lets you go more onto your slope of enlightenment, if you.
Yeah, I think anyone who's been practicing for any number of time will have had probably at least one experience that you can't completely explain or write off as mundane or psychological. Because there's a lot of people do think this is all a giant psychological exercise, but I think a lot of people who have practiced have had experiences that they just can't completely make easy sense of. And I think those experiences become very personal, because if you're having them, I think they can kind of eat at you in a weird way. Like there's this image I saw, and it floated around Instagram for a while, where it's a drawing of a pendulum, and one side says approaching depression, the other side says approaching madness, and in the center it says the comfortable zone. And this image refers to people's relationships with occultism. I'll link it below, because I see it pushed around a lot. And I think that image in and of itself sums it up, because I think, like, you get into this kind of cyclical nature of periods where you're making really fast growth, but you're like connecting more to the divine, but you feel more separated from your life, and you get this kind of nagging feeling like, I'm crazy. And then periods when you have less growth, where you get this nagging feeling of, oh, this is all not real. What am I doing with my life? And I think that cycle is something that, I mean, I've talked to other people who've experienced this, so I know this isn't just me. And I think, like, that's a really toxic mindset. On tarot reading, as a tarot reader myself, and I do believe in tarot, I fully do, I've definitely had people, a person in my life actually called me a fraud, essentially, and a scammer, a person I know in person. And that really hurt me and upset me, because I was like, okay, well, this is something that helps me. And, okay, let's say I'm crazy, right? Let's say that this is all bullshit, nothing's real, and my tarot, even though I believe it's real, is not, right? Like, let's go that direction. Even if somehow, like, none of this is real and I'm, crazy or whatever, tarot in and of itself is a good tool regardless. Because whether or not you believe tarot is mystical, tarot is good advice. Like, let's take all the excitement out of it, right? And the Kabbalah and the numerology and the gematria and all these kind of bells and esoteric whistles. Even on its surface level, I mean, tarot is just guidance, right? Like, tarot cards, even if you don't believe in any of it, like, you could pull any card off that deck and it could still help you. And I think with tarot, like, it can help people even if there's no magic at all. Like, even if it's not spiritual, it's still good advice and it still teaches good lessons. And I think, like, a thing to kind of reassure us is just breaking things down like that. Like, the way that tarot is good advice, even if somehow we're crazy, right? Like, a lot of these occult things, even if they're not real, they're still tools that can help you succeed, right? And I think kind of going through that mind loop can help you reassure yourself that, okay, so what if I am crazy? Like, right? Like, so what if I'm crazy? If I'm crazy, it's still working, and I'm still growing as a person, and I'm still finding something I love, and am reaching a place of success and deeper personal understanding. So even if I'm wrong, right? And even if you're wrong, you're still getting something out of it. And I think, like, there's still value in that. Like, even if it's not mystical, there's still something that can be gained and something powerful. Because, I mean, psychology and the occult are beautifully intertwined in this really fascinating way. I think just remembering, like, so what? And just going through the cycle can really kind of help fight that imposter syndrome, right? Or at least it does for me.
One thing that I'd like to talk about is how personal gnosis can relate to imposter syndrome. I think that, like you had mentioned before, like, we can break down the occult, we can break it down, and we can get rational. This helps regardless of if magic exists or not. But then there are certain things with people's personal gnosis where you start to question more. Okay, this isn't established. This is unverified. This is unverified personal gnosis. How do I go about navigating that? And I think this is something that affects me a lot because I have a lot of personal gnosis in my system of magic and my own practices. And I think it's something that a lot of people encounter, especially because personal gnosis can lead to Mount Stupid in the Dunning-Kruger effect. It can lead to that peak because if you rely solely on personal gnosis, you can fall into a lot of traps because oftentimes with personal gnosis we don't understand everything about it. It's usually something veiled, not always directly obvious. I can take this from lots of examples from my own personal experiences and other people's personal experiences where they take something way too literally, and they run with that to its ultimate extreme. I think that with personal gnosis, what you need to do is you need to break it down, and you need to separate it from established occult history and look at it on its own right. If it's refuting something that already exists, you should not saying that it isn't valid. It's just something that you should look into and see. Okay, is this directly saying that whatever established practice is wrong, or is it saying a deeper meaning about that practice?
Yeah, and I think when it comes to personal correspondences and symbolism that you gain from personal gnosis, something to remember is, at least in my experience, and something that's helped me break things down, is a lot of the times the symbols I get during these experiences or the kind of associations are more something that relate to me and my history and my associations due to, like, my beliefs, my environment, what I've spent my life around, rather than, like, by the book associations. Like, if you look at a correspondence chart from various authors or various systems, like, you'll see things that contradict each other. Like, certain correspondence charts will say certain things that others don't. I think we need to remember that we got these correspondences somewhere, and somewhere down the line, someone probably extrapolated from personal symbolism. And when we're extrapolating from, like, multiple people's experiences, we still need to remember that a lot of the time the symbolism that comes to us is personal, and, like, gauging why a correspondence exists. I mean, eventually down the line it's going to come from probably that it was channeled directly or someone came up with it. Like, in occultism, at some point, and in religion, somebody came up with it or somebody experienced it for the first time, right? Like, we create these huge, like, understandings, like, basic things that we know work, and it all started with one person, no matter what it is. And I think, like, we take certain occult things as fact, or certain things as it's such a traditional thing, everyone believes this, like saying, like, red connects to love, or, like, the LBRP banishes things, right? Like, these very, like, common understandings. We need to remember that even these common understandings came from someone's first understanding. And no matter what it is, there's been someone who has given us this truth that we accept as a truth, and we all kind of agree with. Someone did it first, and that person probably questioned themselves just as much.
I relate a lot of unverified personal gnosis almost to dream interpretation in a way. A lot of people say that there is a whole, like, there is definitions for certain events in a dream. If your teeth are all falling out, you lose control. If you're running from or you're losing control of your life. If you're running from an ambiguous figure, you feel like there's an oncoming thing that you're not prepared for to happen. When we talk about unverified personal gnosis, however, there is not a one and done. Much like Georgina said, this information has to come from an origin source, or it's extrapolated from an origin source. I've personally always struggled with the idea of swords being air and wands being fire. It just doesn't make sense to me. I've since learned that that's one of Golden Dawn's doings, and I fully disagree with it, but that, like, that's just something that I don't identify with. When it comes down to my workings, since I don't identify with it, or since I disagree with it at, like, its core, I can't really recognize it or see it, so I work with what I can see, and that has ultimately yielded me better results. Traditionally, this would mean that I am reading tarot by technicality wrongfully or incorrectly, and when I do read it the traditional way, it just lacks sense for me. That's not to say that I just dumped the entire tarot system and, you know, made up my own. I base a lot of my readings off of imagery because I resonate with images, colors, symbols, stuff like that, and I feel like I can extrapolate a lot from an image. Whenever it comes into my practice, whenever I see things in my meditation, I pay attention to lines and dots and angles and stuff like that, numbers of things. When I look at these things and I look at their correspondences throughout, and then I meditate on it for myself, I get things that aren't entirely separate, but they are recognizably different. As to where, to compare it back to dream interpretations, think of it as though someone who randomly had a dream of all of their teeth falling out because they feel like they're losing control of their life, versus someone who has an upcoming dentist appointment who has a dream that their dentist is responsible for losing all of their teeth. Those are two similar situations that obviously have different roots or different sources because it plays directly into your personal psyche and your personal experience. Now, does this mean that they both can say you lack control in your life? Yes, because you have to give up part of your control for your dentist to perform his job. And if you're randomly having this dream of your teeth falling out, then it can mean that you just feel like you're generally losing control of your life. There's a lot of different directions to kind of take something that happens to you personally. You can understand it as an understanding of what the general public has, but it's very important, I've noticed at least, it's very important to develop your own understanding in its relation to you.
Yeah, and I think something that we forget, and something that, I mean, I should probably reassure myself whenever I talk to new people at community events and things, is it's okay to disagree. There's a reason why there's so many religions and traditions and directions and paths and symbolism. Like there's reasons why different, like, cultures have different meanings for different symbols, is that there's multiple ways to get to the same truth, and that it's okay to disagree with each other. I think we kind of, like, get into this mindset where we all, since we're a community, like, because let's be real, like, all these, like, really vastly different traditions kind of get lumped together under the category of occultism, even if they're very, very different. And, like, we're all lumped, like, all of occultism is the most broad thing you could say, because there's occultism in every religion, in every culture, in every society throughout time. And so I think, like, the fact that there are these rich cultures and we have so many different views over so many different things, like, it's proof that it's okay to disagree. Like, you don't have to agree with every other occultist you see on the internet, or every occultist you see on a forum or in person. Like, it's okay to disagree with each other, and it's possible that you're both right, because in the end, like, we're all striving towards the same things, right? Like, we're all striving towards control, the truth, ascendance, enlightenment, however you would like to phrase it, or whatever you specifically see as your goal, or whatever. Like, we're all aiming for the same things, we're just taking different directions to it.
And I don't think any one path is inherently more legitimate than others. Like, let's be real, like, I've seen people from vastly different cultures and religions and practices who have had strong results. Like, you can't, like, I think, like, dogma is something that we, as occultists, claim we've moved away from, but at the same time, almost move towards. Like, we can disagree on what a correspondence is, and that's fine. Like, it's okay if our personal gnosis contradicts with someone else's personal gnosis, because for all we know, we could both be right, or we could both be wrong. I mean, we really don't know. I think occultism is something that's not, it's not objective, you know? Like, this is all a completely new frontier in terms of, like, psychology and all that, so, like, it's not concrete, and I think that's one of the beauties of occultism, that it's so different from, like, being in the regular world. It's so personal and so experiential. And so I think we just need to kind of be okay with disagreeing, and if our gnosis contradicts what we've been taught or what we think, to be okay with changing our minds and moving away from what we've lived through and the orthodoxy that we cling to at times. And just know that it's okay to disagree, and it's okay to change our views, and it's okay to comprehend the possibility that multiple people could be right and multiple traditions could be right. So I think this idea of truth is, like, one of these, like, ultimate goals of occultism that we talk about, like, finding truth. But in the end, I mean, the reason why we're still chasing truth and finding truth is because we don't know it, you know? Like, there's a reason why it's our goals, because we don't grasp it. And I think we need to just, because I think, like, to be an imposter, there has to be a truth, right? There has to be a true occultist, that we're not. We're the fraud, right? We're not the true occultist. But I mean, like, is there any occultist that's the true occultist who has reached the final truth? Because to reach the final truth, I mean, why would you be an occultist after that point? Like, in the end, I mean, we talk about, like, transcending or ascending. The ultimate ascending and transcendent moment is death. Like, I think all of occultism is chasing. So in that sense, like, there is no true occultist or no completed occultist or whatever. And so I think imposter syndrome exists because there's no way to be that true occultist in the end.
Always been in humanity, but ever since I was raised, being wrong is a bad thing, right? To be wrong is like a bad thing. Like, it's something that you should not want, or you do not want, and you should not want to accept it, and you do not want to accept it. And it's one of those mindsets that I've recently tried to get away from and have more of, like, a conversation rather than an argument. I want to know why people disagree with me and where they're getting their knowledge from. And touching back on our last episode, something that I feel like I didn't touch on a lot, when it comes to people rejecting text, especially text or lessons from the Abrahamic faith, I feel like a lot of people discount stuff just because they disagree with it. I feel like it's more powerful to know what you disagree with rather than to just be like, I disagree with it, but I only know bits and parts and pieces, and mostly what I know of it is the people that represent it, and not the thing in its whole. I've recently only started becoming comfortable with being wrong. I feel like being comfortable with being wrong leads to less severity in imposters and having this kind of imposter syndrome air surround you. And once you're more okay with being wrong and you feel like you could always be wrong, or you could be arguing with someone who you think is wrong, and you kind of dissolve that into, well, this topic doesn't really have any right side or wrong side. There's only your personal backing to it and where you're getting your knowledge from and how you're understanding or comprehending that that knowledge is completely different from one person to another. You know, a lot of people within the same belief system, you can go to one person preaching about their beliefs and another, and they can sound extremely different, but their root is the same.
Yeah, I mean, I think being wrong, especially, I mean, since we're an online show, I think on the internet, being wrong is almost more severe than in person, because when you're wrong on the internet, like, a whole barrage of people will come to shame you, right? Like it'll get comments, it'll get posts, you'll be, like, screenshot and discredited forever if you say one thing that's wrong. And I think we forget, like, even the most famous occultists ever, those people were probably wrong at some point, and, I mean, we've all done things that are wrong. It's human nature. Like, your favorite author and your favorite occultist and the people that you idolize, they're human too. And I can assure you, at some point, they've probably said something wrong, or, like, gotten something wrong, or misinterpreted something. Like, it's a human nature thing to mess up. And I think, like, since we're on the internet and we have this kind of cancel culture and stuff, like, people are so scared to mess up because of backlash. I think we forget, like, it's normal to mess up. And I think, like, people get shamed for changing opinions a lot. I've seen it pop up a lot recently because of some political stuff. Like, we should normalize admitting that you were wrong and changing your opinion. Like, just because one religion is what you set out with to the beginning, or one ritual you, like, swore by, doesn't mean you have to do that forever. Like, part of growth is being wrong. Like, if we were never wrong and we never disagreed with our past selves, like, we would be where we began. Like, there's no growth without fucking up. It's part of how we grow as people. Like, when you're a kid, like, you make a ton of mistakes. Like, you touch a hot stove and it burns you and you're like, oh, I can't touch this. Like, in occultism, it's the same thing. Like, I know I talk about, and I've preached about a little bit, like, always research and know exactly what you're doing before going into it. And I think that, to an extent, like, as much as you can, do that, but at some point you're probably going to mess up, right? At some point you're going to do a ritual that goes wrong. Something's going to go wrong. And I think every occultist, well, maybe not every occultist, maybe I just don't know what I'm doing, but I think most occultists have done something that blew up in their face, or didn't work exactly how they intended it to, or something, like, to that degree, or they interpreted something wrong that later they realized meant something completely different, and they were like, oh, wow. And I think, like, those experiences help us find our path, and help us grow almost more than the things that work. Like, pain is part of development. And it's okay to be wrong. It's good to be wrong. And I guess, in a sense, we're all imposters. There you go. The ultimate validation. We're all in the valley of despair all the time, together. We're frauds together, as a unit, as a collective.
I saw a bit of imposter syndrome leak through in that statement. You actually said, or maybe it's just me and I'm doing something wrong. I feel like that's a huge part of imposter syndrome. I feel like having this feeling that you're always wrong, or this daunting air that, like, you're a fuck up. So having this mentality that, like, you're constantly fucking up, or, like, you are a fuck up, is very evident that even as we talk about knowing that being wrong is okay, there is still an air of having this imposter syndrome with us. It's always something that haunts us, or leans over us, or surrounds us, because without our barrier of knowledge, confidence, personal gnosis, and feeling like we are doing something that is for the bettering of our lives, or feel like we are doing something that takes control of our lives, then we have this small voice of doubt in our heads, and it can meet halfway with people who disagree with you. And then the air that surrounds you will create your syndrome of being an imposter, and all of these voices together say, you are wrong, you shouldn't be feeling good about this, you should be contemplating why this is wrong. And that nagging feeling, I feel like, I've always felt like, is almost a sign of truth in itself. Because I feel like people get kind of deterred from people they can't understand or can't identify with. And as occultists, as people who are literally treated in the religious worlds, in the theological and philosophical worlds, we are treated almost as if we live on the outskirts of society, or we're like the untouchables or the morons, because we don't follow a general population, or we don't follow a large following, and we develop our own understanding of things. It's very easy for other people to invalidate us. It is much more powerful than one person going, you're wrong, to an entire church going, well, you're misguided and wrong. Like, and that's something that I even see in psychological treatment. If you have an unverified personal gnosis and you describe it as a divine interaction, I've seen multiple case studies where the psychologist at hand will write it off as a form of psychotic development. I'm not sure what the appropriate term is, so I apologize if that is misnaming it or misnomer. And the backing for that reasoning is that not a large group of people believe, experience, or follow it, which will extremely feed into your insecurity of being wrong all the time. And it's one of these cyclical things that you feel like you're wrong, you step back, you say, well, if I'm wrong, am I doing any harm to myself? Then you go forward knowing that you're not doing harm for yourself. You feel like you're either trying to grow or you're trying to develop, and then you have some voice come onto you or into you and say, that's not how you do it. And then the cycle continues. That's how I've always experienced it from across a psychological and theological perspective.
I think that overall the truth is extremely subjective, and we're not going to end up finding the one source truth, and we're not all going to be right all the time, we're not all going to be wrong all the time. I think taking in everything as subjective and not as objective is healthy to do, and I think it's alright to change your thoughts. A good example of this is Crowley's interpretation of the HGA. He changed it several times throughout his life, and many people still disagree with him to this day on what exactly the HGA is. And it's an ongoing conversation. So I think that it's important for us to have these discussions and to not feel shamed for having wrong ideas, for having misinterpretations, for not fully grasping something, because like Georgia said earlier, we're all beginners at some point. We're not all masters of everything.
Mysticism and occultism and witchcraft and whatever term you want to call this experience is that everyone that I've ever spoken to about this personally has experienced imposter syndrome. And I think this doubt and this questioning is a normal thing, and to a small degree actually healthy, because if you don't have any skepticism, you can really go off the deep end really quickly. And I think it's just, we need to not let this... It's about boundaries and like, kind of trying to rationalize it and talk ourselves down and figure out a healthy way to be skeptical and still not make ourselves feel crazy all the time. And just remember that we're not the only occultist in the world. Even if you're in a small, tiny, podunk-ass town, like I was growing up, you're not the only occultist in the world. You're not the only person going through this experience. There have been mystics since the beginning of time, and I'm sure those early mystics probably felt the same way. And that this whole thing is a crazy thing, and it's a wild experience. Going down this path is hard mentally. It's testing. It pushes you through a lot of mental things that you wouldn't necessarily know it would even touch. And spiritual growth is painful, and it's normal to feel like a fraud. And if other people call you a fraud, I mean, they're another person, they're not you. You shouldn't really living your life for other people, which is someone who did that for a really long time. It's just really toxic, and I think that you should just keep chasing your path, keep questioning, and stay weird. Stay weird, occultism. Stay weird. We're the best fringe of theological society out there.
Ultimately, I think it's a whole bunch of hoopla for a belief system. That's the best way I could describe it. I feel like a lot of people are stuck in saying your beliefs are wrong, but ultimately they're beliefs. And a belief can't... I mean, I guess a belief can be wrong if it's a belief on something that can be, like, factually proven. But if it's something like a divine belief or an occult belief or any way you feel like accessing the self or outside the self and working with your micros and macros within your life, you can kind of develop a sense of what you are willing to accept and willing to deny, and that's not something that others can accept or deny for you. I agree with Georgina in saying that skepticism, having a healthy dose of it, is a healthy thing. If you accept too much, you go off the deep end. If you reject too much, you become kind of stuck in a loop where your growth will be from refusal to accept anything, and ultimately that won't lead to much growth that a lot of cultists aim for. I think that imposter syndrome is both healthy and detrimental at the same time. I think keeping yourself in check is a very good thing to do, but don't let that check control you. You should be the one putting yourself in check. If things make you step back, look at the whole picture, make a couple adjustments if you find necessary, and then resume.
This has been Georgina.
I have been AIDEN.
And I am Chandler.
And you have been listening to Occultism with a Side of Salt.